I'm also incredibly excited to welcome Kimberly Turner, who is an International Security Program postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Belfer Center. For this academic year, or no, for next academic year, she'll be a postdoctoral fellow at Brown University at the Watson Institute and Harvard's Belfer Center. And then she will be joining the University of Pittsburgh as an assistant professor of international affairs in the fall of 2023. Her research interests include populist demonstrations, political violence, and political economy and methodology. And we're very excited to have you here, Dr. Turner, for this talk.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. As you noted, this talk is called The Winner or Flop, Measuring Nonviolent Campaign Success in Authoritarian Settings. And so this past week, the world watched in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine. And even though spontaneous demonstrations had been deemed illegal and repression was almost surely guaranteed, ordinary Russian citizens have taken to the streets to protest their government's aggressions. Over 6,500 people have been jailed over a 5-day period. And despite the inherent dangers, people continue to express their anger via street demonstrations. As Eric Burakowski of Time magazine noted this week, street protests are nothing new in Russia. In 2020, the Levada Center, which is the leading independent polling group in Russia, found that people in 2020 were 4 times more likely to engage in protests than they were in 2014. And since Occupy Wall Street, we've seen the advent of the mass protests as the main or premier tactic to use against governments. Even a global pandemic was unable to destabilize the popularity of mass protesting as an anti-governmental tactic. And there's a fair number of charts that are in this particular presentation, so I'm going to make sure I describe them verbally as well. And so in this chart here, what we see is the explosive growth of nonviolent protests. Nonviolent protests doubled almost between 2000 and 2009, whereas in 2000, ACLED found that 233 protests were coded, and they found that they had up to 505 peaceful protests they were able to identify in 2009. However, it's been an almost linear exponential growth in protests in the decade after that. The 505 peaceful protests of 2009 have been wildly eclipsed in 2019, where ACLED recorded 81,107 peaceful protests in that year alone. And so no regime type has been exempt from the spread of mass protests. While mass protests largely began in the West as a backlash to the austerity programs and policies of the Great Recession, where we've really seen their impact and their frequency has been in the previously immune authoritarian world. And so a decade later, it's appropriate to ask ourselves, how should we judge the efficacy of these movements? Are these movements successful? Protest is costly. And so at the end of the day, we want to be able to answer the question of whether protesting is worth the effort. And so today, my talk covers several questions. First, we look at what is considered a successful protest, and then how can we quantify success, and what type of concessions are demonstrators actually obtaining from their protest activity? And can we score protests on their successfulness? If so, how do we account for issues such as democratic backsliding or new repressive policies that we can also then fold into success to consider the net societal effects of these movements in the aftermath? And I finish up with the implications of this work and kind of talk a little bit about the future work that I'll be doing on this topic. And so to begin, let's define protest success. Conceptually, the idea of success is a pretty ambiguous term. The canonical definition of protest success was established by Gamson in 1990. Gamson stated that a movement can only be deemed successful if it's fulfilled all of its stated demands. And this definition has proved remarkably stable over the decades. As movements may have multiple fluid and occasionally contradictory goals, what we've seen is some modifications of this definition. And so many scholars have modified the definition to address the movement's maximalist goal. And so movements are now assessed by whether or not they've attained their maximalist goal and or their full slate of stated demands. And scholars like this particular definition, in particular because it's very parsimonious. It provides a parsimonious binary measure of success where only protests that have obtained their stated demands and obtained new advantages within a single calendar year after the conclusion of protest activities may be deemed successful. So it's a very simple and straightforward criteria or metric by which we can evaluate a protest. And so using this Gamsonian definition and this binary measure of success, we can see that most protests can actually be considered failures. Using the NAVCO 2.1 data set by Chenoweth and Shea of 2019, I coded for every authoritarian state that experienced a protest between 2002 and 2019. And what we see here is that protests overwhelmingly fail underneath this binary measure. However, if we wish to understand the full extractive capabilities of movements, their ability to garner concessions from regimes, this is a relatively crude measure. There's a range of concessions that demonstrators may obtain, in addition and outside of their maximalist demands. And so while the nominal measure leads us to conclude that protests, and especially authoritarian states, overwhelmingly fail, new data offers us greater insights into the extractive capabilities of movements. The NAVCO 2.1 data set, in addition to having a success variable, also includes an ordered categorical progress variable that reports how closely a movement got to their maximalist goal. And this data set, I should note, is limited only to maximalist campaigns, where the ultimate goal is the removal of the executive or overturning of the government. And in this way, we keep the case set steady. And we also are dealing with movements that have kind of most extreme ultimate goals. And so the NAVCO data set identified 6 possible outcomes that a movement can obtain: failure, as well as 5 progressions towards success: status quo, limited concessions, verbal concessions, significant concessions, and your ultimate goal of success. What we should note here in this chart that is presented on the screen is a status quo concessions indicates that a movement was able to emerge, but failed to obtain any of their stated demands. Limited concessions includes offers such as food subsidies or tax breaks that fall far short of the maximalist goal, but does offer some appeasement. Verbal concessions is where the regime acknowledges the demonstrator's grievance and begins negotiations, and can be seen as a crucial sort of gateway concession that legitimizes the movement. Significant concessions fall short of the maximalist goal, but fulfills most of the movement's stated demands. And your final category is success, which is the maximalist goal of removal of the regime or the executive. And so this idea of success as progressive is useful when addressing these maximalist campaigns, as the removal of an executive or overturn of a government is highly unlikely, regardless of regime type. So by framing success as progressive rather than absolute, we can better appreciate how efficient movements are in getting towards their maximalist goal than we would underneath a binary measure. And we can also evaluate the types of concessions movements are capable of obtaining and how closely these concessions meet the maximalist goal. And so looking at this particular chart that's on the screen here, we can see that when evaluating authoritarian states, where we might expect maximalist goals to be almost impossible, movements were actually very effective. In fact, the highest frequency outcome was success, followed by status quo, and then followed by verbal. Excuse me. And so this also, however, can be broken out by regime type within authoritarian states, dealing with anocracies, or what we call hybrid regimes, as well as authoritarian states, which are all defined by their particular polity scores. And so when we look at anocracies, where they have polity scores of 5 to -5, and authoritarian states, where you have polity scores of -6 to 10, what we see is that regardless of authoritarian type, success continues to be the most frequent outcome of these particular movements. I will note that throughout this presentation, the definition of anocracy or hybrid regimes is going to be slightly different than what we typically use in polity scores. Polity typically defines it as 5 to -5. However, the goal of this particular work is to look at only authoritarian states because I argue that they have very differential attainment barriers and likelihood of outcomes. And so I set here anocracies or hybrids to mean from a score of 0 on policy to -5, and authoritarian states to retain its original definition of a -6 to -10. And so I wanted to note that. And so the NAVCO data set offers us a very nice typology of concessions, but it wasn't intended to reveal every discrete concession that is obtained by the movement. Only the highest outcome is coded. And so absent is information on lower level concessions. So we can conceive of a movement that obtains the removal of executive, but fails to obtain any sort of lower level concessions, as well as a movement that obtains concessions all the way along that progress score. And this is important for several reasons. While the NAVCO progress variable is definitely a vast improvement on the typical binary measure, movements are clustered into particular categories, say the limited category. And so without information on the full range of concessions that movement may have obtained, it's very difficult to offer comparisons or discrimination power between movements that fall within the same category. And all movements within a particular category may not necessarily be equal or equitable in terms of how many concessions or the types of concessions that they obtained. And we do care about these differences because we care about the relative successfulness of a movement's playbook. So if a particular sort of tactic produces particular sorts of outcomes, we want to know the vast range of outcomes that a movement has actually been able to produce. And so we want to be able to discriminate between movements, and as such, we need quantitative data on the discrete types of concessions that these movements obtained. It also doesn't clarify what type of data we're working with. It doesn't clarify whether or not we're dealing with dominance data. When concessions are coded as ordered, it doesn't necessarily mean that in order to receive a score of 4, that you also obtain concessions within the first, second, and third categories, typically what we would consider as dominance data. And so this doesn't necessarily tell us what kind of data we're dealing with, and this is important in terms of what types of statistical analyses we can actually use. So by going back in and recoding the NAVCO data, we get a better understanding of the full richness of outcomes movements can produce and whether or not what kind of data structure we're actually working with. So I began a new project that codes daily event data from the NAVCO 3.0 data set, and we identified 34 indicators and concessions that cover the order categories of that progress variable, from the status quo category up into the success category. And here on screen, what we have is an example of the type of concessions that were obtained by the Tunisian demonstrators between 2011 and 2012. And what we should note is that over the course of 1,450 rows that covered between December 2010 and December 2012, Tunisia was able to obtain 23 different types of concessions. And neither the binary coding nor a progressive ordered coding was able to kind of show us or give example of the vastness of the type of concessions the demonstrators are actually able to extract from their regime. And so we found that Tunisia obtained a wide range of concessions that covered almost all of the categories. And so I want to note here on this chart really quickly that we have here just a sample. We don't have all 23 all 23 concessions are here, and the count of lines mentioning indicator is just the number of counts that particular outcome was mentioned in the data set. It does not indicate the frequency that there's 18 executives removed. The executive was removed only once, but it was noted 18 times in the data set. So I wanted to clarify that really quickly. And so there's several other issues with this canonical definition of success that Gamson gave us. First and foremost, because it requires that a protest obtain all of their stated goals and or their maximalist goal within a single calendar year, it creates an artificially high threshold for success. Even in interstate war, you're not required to win every battle to be considered the winner. And so underneath the Gamsonian definition, protesters actually have a higher threshold for success than we expect of nation states. And by focusing on stated demands, it offers a less precise count of the movement's outcomes, as it ignores unintended consequences, which may also be positive or negative. And lastly, this definition fails to address kind of the net societal effects, or what happens to society in the aftermath of the movement. And this last concern is centered in the original question of whether or not protesting is a worthwhile endeavor. We see that movements can accomplish a lot, but what are the costs associated with those accomplishments? Success isn't unidimensional. There's always costs associated with any new gains. So how do we account for those negative outcomes when we're quantifying success? Outcomes are considered the unit of analysis in the political consequences literature. And this particular literature is very small in comparison, a very small portion of the protest literature, as most conflict scholars focus on the causal roots of protests rather than their outcomes. And there's a reason for this. Protest outcomes are complex and dynamic. They contain beneficial and negative unintended consequences, and they're just notoriously difficult to track and measure over time and space. However, with new data sets, such as ACLID, SPEED, NAVCO, and the mass mobilization data sets, we can use new statistical techniques that allows us to treat success as multidimensional. So what do I mean by net societal effects? Movements produce costly outcomes as well as new advantages, such as foreign direct investment flight, property damages, or democratic backsliding. And so success can be conceptualized as multidimensional, comprised of these costs that are associated with these gains. And so we can quantify success as an additive scale where movements are scored on their costs and gains. And like the ordered progress variable that allowed us to evaluate demonstrators' extractive capabilities, the NAVCO 2.1 dataset also includes an ordered repression variable. So using a cost-benefit approach, we can answer Guigony's inherently normative question of whether protest is worth it via these ordered variables. And to accomplish this, I created success scores ranging from -10, which indicates complete failure, to +10, perfect success. I analyzed solely nonviolent, peaceful maximalist movements that did not have violent flanks and solely in authoritarian states, so polity scores of 0 to -10 from the NAVCO 2.1 dataset. And to do this, in order to do this, I use Mokken Scale analysis so we can treat success as multidimensional. And so I use the psychometric approach, Mokken Scale analysis, which is a non-parametric IRT method that has a more relaxed set of assumptions that can handle mixed models of continuous latent and non-continuous variables. And because we're dealing with relatively rough data, Mokken Scale analysis allows you to produce two subscales of gains and costs that it kind of handles these data limitations that we have. And it features item difficulty for these ordered outcomes that allows for discrimination between campaigns, which is what we want, campaigns within the same category, I should note. And so this way, we're able to produce concession scores or gain scores, as well as a score for a movement in terms of their overall net societal effect, where we address both their costs and their gains. And these raw estimates can be used for future analyses. So when we're treating success as multidimensional underneath the cost-benefit approach and producing the success scores, what do we get? Using the 34 campaigns that I had identified previously, we scored them on this additive scale created by using the Mokken Scale analysis, and we see that the majority of campaigns saw a negative societal effect ranging from -2.7 to -7.5, indicating that in the year after a campaign concludes, societal costs during and after the movement are higher than the new advantages campaigns are able to produce. So while we see that campaigns were very successful in terms of concessions, those concessions are quite often overshadowed by the pain that is necessary in order to obtain those new accomplishments. And this new measure that I create, these success scores, while they give a more pessimistic account than I would have hoped for, it has some additional benefits as it caught misclassified cases such as Jordan. Underneath the binary success measure, Jordan is considered a failure as the executive wasn't removed. However, they had very high concession attainments that they had and very low levels of repression. And so as we can see here, Jordan actually ends up being the second most successful campaign in all of these cases, as opposed to being deemed as a failure as it would underneath the binary measure. And so we see that protests may trigger, at least in the short term, because this only deals with the year after the campaign has concluded, the protests may trigger painful aftermaths for society. And so some may say, well, look, Ganson and others were right. And protests are more failures than successes, really, at the end of the day. And my answer is, hang on, they were only partially correct. The answer is more nuanced than that. Gance's measure was intended to only evaluate the extractive capability of protests. And we actually see, using these gain scores, that protests are very, very successful in terms of their extractive capabilities. However, in terms of their societal impact, what society has to bear and whether or not those costs are worth it, we find that the protests maybe don't do as great as we would want them to do, at least in that immediate aftermath. More information and more coding and more data analysis and gathering needs to be done for us to understand the intermediate and long-term effects of protests upon their relative societies. So to wrap this up, I went very fast, and I'm sorry I was speeding along. In terms of the implications of these success scores, whether you care only about the extractive capabilities of the campaign or you're also interested in their societal effect, my measure offers an improvement upon this binary measure. So for policymakers who need to convey whether protests elsewhere at home are likely to get, the protesters are likely to get their demands, these subscales offer an intuitive comparative scoring method based off of the severity of the campaign, their gains ability. And this is, of course, useful for foreign policy decision-making, in which circumstances and country features might best which kind of circumstances, country features might best support demonstrators as opposed to the regime. This helps us move past purely national interest arguments. If a protest is likely to succeed, based on looking at other a priori protests featuring similar compositions, should we support them as an external party or not? Are they likely to do well, or are they likely to see a painful aftermath? Protests aren't going away, but instead are increasing in frequency and durability. And so while there's a deep bench of policy and political science scholars in civil war and violent low-level conflict, much less attention has been paid prior to the Black Lives Matter protests, much less attention has been paid to the security implications of nonviolent movements. So really what we care about here is, for especially potential new activists, is there the possibility of winning? Is there a possibility of getting what you want? What type of tactics and what type of playbook produce certain types of outcomes? And are we seeing consistency in outcomes across campaigns that utilize the same playbook? And so we really need to incorporate nonviolent movements into the security literature, the same as we do violent forms of political behavior. And so for journalists and scholars and policymakers who care about the aftermath of a movement, who wish to address the overall effects of a movement upon a society, both the valleys and the peaks of protest behavior, the success scores offers comparative scores that allows us insights in the short term of what the aftermath of a protest is likely to look like. So we're not shocked or surprised by democratic backsliding or new authoritarian features that emerge in the aftermath of these, quite often protests that are seeking democratic goals. And how will the emergence of a movement impact the ability, quite often, of a country to conduct business? Things like foreign direct investment, flight, and property damage are rarely incorporated into our analyses of protest outcomes. However, they're definitely portions or part of the landscape of the protest outcome schema. And so here we start to be able to have an incorporation of variables and topics that are typically excluded from our analyses of what's the likelihood of us having sort of negative economic outcomes that may overshadow some of the civil rights or democratic gains that a movement may possibly have obtained. And so this last slide kind of deals just with, are protests worth the effort? What does this tell us about campaigns? These success scores tells us that nonviolent campaigns are a mixed bag. They're an effective political behavior mechanism in gaining new advantages, but may incur harsh reprisal in the immediate aftermath. We simply require much more data on the intermediate, long-term cultural, societal, and biographical effects of movements to fully understand the effects of campaigns, even 2 years after a movement has concluded. It also tells us in the short term, for society at large, campaigns are terribly expensive in terms of societal costs. And societies may wish to know that up front so that they're prepared at the end of the day. And so it may be interpreted that underneath the cost-benefit analysis, maybe they're not worth it, but we just need to give them more time or gather more information so we can determine, at least especially for the intermediate, that additional gains and shifts, because gains take longer than a single year to be implemented, we may not be fully capturing all of the beneficial conditions that emerge from these protests. So we may actually be underestimating the overall benefits of protest behavior. And so the data here is relatively limited, and so additional sort of work needs to be done. And so I had launched the Mass Protest Index, which covers a large number of indicators for both concessions as well as repressive behaviors of governments in the 5 years after a protest has concluded. So this gives us a little bit more time for new gains to actually be implemented and for us to see the effects, to actually capture and measure the effects of these movements, having a longer temporal period. And so lastly, while I do want to note that the success scores come off as a seeming refutation of nonviolent movements, I want to reiterate that protests aren't going anywhere. And so while these scores may seem to kind of denounce the growth of this particular behavior set, we've seen this sort of tactic become extremely popular and become extremely also useful in terms of gaining new concessions and forcing regimes to deal with civil concessions that they typically wouldn't have even considered. And so here's where qualitative studies can really quite often round out the story that we're trying to tell. The data only gives us a limited view. And so qualitative studies, and there's a number of very careful and important qualitative studies in political science and sociology, can help us to understand the aftermath of these campaigns more closely. And that needs to be incorporated into our quantitative data sets and adapted in so that we are actually presenting a full picture of how protests actually are viewed and actually are incorporated into the societal norms in the aftermath of a protest. And so projects like the MPI, the Mass Protest Index, should take advantage of the wealth of information that's located within these qualitative studies to populate new data sets. And so this study, I want to thank you for everyone for allowing me to talk with you about this study, this examination of the successfulness, the relative successfulness of protests in the 1 year after their conclusion. And I look forward to any particular questions and feedback. This is a work in progress. So any particular feedback you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Turner. So if you would like to ask any questions, I have a couple, but I will wait until our audience members have the option. Yeah, Allison.
Thank you. This is really interesting. There are kind of two major areas of questioning that I had. One was just a reflection on some of the protest movements that I've witnessed more up close. It seems like politics and sort of the mechanisms of government are designed to move very slowly and are designed not to be very responsive. That's sort of the nature of bureaucratic states, whether in authoritarian or democratic systems. And so I would postulate that even as that may be the sort of stated intention of a lot of protest movements, that a lot of what like the underlying drivers are, it feels like a sort of an accumulation of collective anger that needs to be aligned and needs to be targeted, and that it's almost about sort of putting out a structured narrative of a different kind of reality. And so when I think of that, it's like, okay, some of those are probably not even remotely successful in the short term, but create as an accumulation of sort of a major shift in societal opinions over more like 15, 20-year timelines. And so I'm curious about how that fits into this and the sort of essence of timeline and accumulation across multiple protests.
Oh, thank you for that's really thank you for that. That's something where when I started doing this project, I had read a couple of new scholars there's some really fantastic, interesting scholars who are working on biographical impacts of protests that discuss this issue, which is you can't really assess a protest in the generation in which it necessarily occurs, that those effects of a protest, especially authoritarian states, just the ability of a protest to emerge in the first place, and then it opens up the door, acts as a gateway for additional protest behavior. And this is what we've seen in Tunisia, we've seen in various places where they had union activity, but they didn't necessarily have these sort of mass protests, that these mass protests in Hong Kong, et cetera, they didn't just emerge in 2014, in Hong Kong, they came out again in 2016, came out again in 2019. And that it's been this consistent sort of, like, as you noted, accumulated growth of impact of that initial protest of 2014 that can be felt in 2022 that has a number of different outcomes. One is that people are more willing to protest and to challenge the Chinese government. The other is that the Chinese government, the Hong Kong government, have become far more repressive than they had been before. And so these outcomes, these effects, build upon one another and accumulate over time. But it definitely has the aspect of acting as kind of a first mover. Those first mover movements are key to allowing and opening the space in places like Bahrain, where even though Bahrain would have been considered an unmitigated failure in 2011, their protests, they came out again. They've come out almost every single year, and they came out again this year in 2022, where thousands of them came out, and the Bahrain government was shocked that once again that the people actually thought that they could come out and protest. That would have been inconceivable in 2009. And so it's something where these protests, just their ability to exist, to emerge in the first place, and to be durable, to keep coming out, even if they're not getting what they want, they act as a trigger and a stimulus for additional sort of protest behavior and opening up that sort of space for people to react. But just as activists learn, governments learn as well. And so we've seen, in fact, governments implement unbelievably regressive policies that have made this, as you noted, the bureaucratic state even more non-responsive and even more slow to implement even the promises that they made maybe back in 2011, that they realized they can drag their feet and never necessarily implement this because they know that the use of the repressive tactics against demonstrators are instigating less and less international attention. And so they don't necessarily have to kind of do that knee-jerk concession that they may have offered in 2011, 2012. Now they can kind of drag it out. And so the long-term picture is where it gets really interesting, that as you have this long wave, what are the sort of like patterns we can pick out over the long term? You're absolutely right. But unfortunately, the data right now, we're lucky that we have the data this a year out. Like, these are very new data sets. I was very excited to get them. So, this is something that's just a matter of scholars compiling, and then starting to analyze this data. And as we do that, we get a better picture of ultimately what's out there. Thank you, Allison. Appreciate that.
So there's a question, is there a correlation between the gains and cost? For example, do we see the higher value cost when more of the protest demands are met?
Yeah. So what's nice about this is that that was something I was very worried about, whether or not the costs and the concessions were not independent of one another, right? But typically costs start before or a priori to concessions, which is a good thing for me in terms of analyses. So quite often what we'll see is that in any state, including in democracies, the state's initial reaction to a protest coming out is to do heavy policing, to start off a repressive behavior right off the bat. And that repressive behavior quite often only increases over time. And so those repressions start first before any concessions are even necessarily Sorry, are you want me to respond, or you're responding to them?
I'm responding for you.
Oh, gotcha. Thanks. Before any concessions are ever necessarily implemented. So what we actually see is that it's kind of a mixed bag if you look at the opposite direction. As repression increases and we see the highest ones, do we see concessions more likely being higher ranked? And that's a mixed bag there. There's no clear pattern that you see there. In some cases, like Bahrain, you'll have just very high levels of repression and absolutely no concessions are offered. And in other cases, you'll see low levels of repression, such as in Jordan, and the Jordanian king reshuffled the entire parliament, sacked them, and so they actually got very significant sort of concessions. So there's not necessarily a really good pattern that we find between repression levels and the outcomes that are produced. And I would argue that because of time, you don't necessarily can do from concessions to repressions the opposite, because repression typically occurs prior to that. But yeah, thank you. That's really great. Could the website and the last slides be posted in the chat? Yeah, thank you.
I sort of have, I think, what's kind of a follow-up question to that, which is, I was thinking, as you were describing the types of concessions and then also the types of costs, it seems like some of them are concentrated and some of them are dispersed, right? Like repression of activists is a very concentrated cost. But if a large corporation, kind of shuts down its factories and leaves, that potentially has a broader cost to the economy or to people that are like working in those plants or what have you, that aren't necessarily part of the protest movement itself. So I was wondering, like, if there was a way with this methodology to code or somehow treat as separate dimensions, like the types of benefits and costs that are potentially, like releasing a political prisoner is also a concentrated benefit, whereas kind of reshuffling the cabinet or moving closer to democracy is a more dispersed benefit. So I'm wondering if you've thought about kind of ways that you could even further classify the costs and benefits as either being kind of concentrated within or, kind of related to the movement, and then also kind of broader and societal. And, you kind of also could potentially, you talked about economic impacts versus rights. So that would be another classification or a way to think about that. And so I guess have you thought about those things? And would this particular methodology allow you to add additional dimensions to be able to try to estimate those things or not?
It does. Thank you for asking that. That's great. So when I first came up with the mass protest index, what I really I struggled with was lots of times when we sit down and think about what are the benefits that arrive out of a movement. A movement quite often is intended to obtain benefits for their demonstrators. And those demonstrators may not necessarily, what's good for those demonstrators is not necessarily good for the rest of society. Those two things are not necessarily equitable. And so there's demonstrator gains, but there's also societal gains that are separate. And those two things cannot necessarily be conflated with one another. And so that was one of the things where when we started this coding project, and we had just taken Tunisia, and Tunisia had like 16,000 lines. We quickly ran into the issue of, well, how do we parse out societal benefits versus demonstrator benefits? And that inherently was also a normative question as well. Like, what is a societal benefit according to what? And so here's where we could use the stated gains of the campaign to distinctly identify gains that meet the goals of the movement, as well as separate ones, which are ones that, are new civil rights, new freedoms, et cetera. And the same with costs. That was something that was really important to us, which is there are certain costs that are intended to impact the demonstrators alone and not to necessarily impact society at large. Governments are very good at trying to target certain costs and not just be indiscriminate in their repression. And so there was certain things where it's like, if you have mass rape, for example, say that happened in Sudan, that is one that's intended to be a large scale societal cost, as opposed to something like if it was a large group of teachers and doctors and saying that, now we're going to suspend all teaching certificates. So it's a targeted sort of cost. That was one where we started coding out for it. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to treat success as multidimensional. That was one of the reasons why I was looking at non-parametric IRT models, was that it allowed me to treat success as multidimensional, dealing with a very rough edge set of data. And so I knew I wanted to have a number of dimensions, more than just the two that's presented here, that there's a number of dimensions, because there's political, economic, and social dimensions that are included in the Mass Protest Index project that aren't necessarily included in this initial study. And I wanted something that could address this and deal with it the same way the SERI database, which deals with human rights, also uses Mokken Scale analysis, and so is able to capture the various dimensions of human rights issues. And so getting to sort of the concentrate, et cetera, the Mass Protest Index, which is this project, this ongoing project I'm doing right now, does exactly what you're asking, Michelle. It looks at, first of all, economic, political, and social outcomes. It's a little bit different in the aspect that it does quite a bit of coding in Arabic itself. So we're also getting information from national news as opposed to just international news, which has its benefits and negatives, because if it's national news that's controlled by the state, you may be getting propaganda, but also gives you perhaps additional information that you don't get from the international news. So we're trying to mitigate the bias. And in particular, what it does is it definitely addresses sort of stated demands, costs and gains attached to the movement's stated demands, so distinct demands, as well as additional consequences, both gains and costs, that we consider unintentional, right? They're not attached to the stated demand, so we call them unintentional, meaning that they're additional. So Tunisia's new constitution was a happy additional consequence. It was not a stated demand of the demonstrators. It was definitely something that's considered a benefit, and a benefits the society at large as opposed to just the demonstrators. So we have a large number of these types of indicators and consequences included in the larger project that aren't necessarily, this is kind of like the first cut of what we were trying to do. So yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yes.
No, that's exciting. Thank you. I'm glad. I'm excited to hear that you're working on that. So I have one comment and then another question that I think is more kind of measurement qualitative. So in your figure where you show kind of the rank order on this new success failure scale, what I think would be really helpful to illustrate is how your findings are different from like a Gamson definition would be if they were color coded according to success or failure on that definition. Because I think then we would be able to see how many of the ones that have positive scores actually, are coded as failures versus those that are coded with negative scores on your scale would have been also, so that would kind of, I think, be a visual way in that one figure to like show us kind of how you get a substantively different answer potentially from the other. The question I think that's more interesting that I have is you mentioned towards the end of your talk, Black Lives Matter, and thinking about a country like the United States that's very large, where policing is very local. And also, you have the time dimension, which we've already talked about. But then also my guess is that in a lot of communities, so I grew up in Austin, Texas, which is very blue. And so kind of funding for the police has continued to be kind of a city level public policy issue, even though protests have declined. And so what I've witnessed kind of observing what's happening in Austin is that you did have initial protests, and now those activists are going to city council meetings and have changed their advocacy around the debate in this one locality about the new police budget and kind of community policing and what money is being spent where and how the money is being spent. So it's not as much as kind of defunding the police as like refunding or funding in different ways the police and changing policing strategies. So given kind of the scope of a country like the United States, and the decentralized goals of a movement, which, you know, I recognize, like, huge caveat, like you're focusing on authoritarian regimes and you got to get rid of like the head regime, but just kind of as a thought process, what are the kinds of challenges and how could we go about measuring over time and over space the successfulness of protests if their goals are actually kind of administered not at the national level, but at some local level and are widely dispersed? And so there might be a lot of uneven success or failure, and kind of, you know, so I'm very curious to hear kind of from a measurement perspective, how you would think about going about that, or if there are other projects that are kind of working on, you know, measuring success that happens, I guess, at the subnational level. That would have been a much shorter question. How do we measure success at a subnational level in large and diverse states, whether they're authoritarian or not? Like, what are some thoughts or methodologies or ways that you would think about that?
Oh,
sorry, it's a tough question. I know.
I was saying, like, nice. I feel like I'm back in college. Like, hey. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and one that I largely avoided by doing maximalist campaigns. That's why I stuck to it, and so it's at the national government, et cetera. It's an important question to ask, right? Because it's something where when you're dealing with a particular time period, such as Arab Spring, these are anti-governmental, directed at the national government. But in 2000, what we saw is that increasingly it wasn't necessarily, and this was across the globe, it wasn't necessarily the national government. And in lots of places, it's not necessarily the national government that's the ultimate goal. It's some sort of change that may be directed at the national government, but is designed to be implemented to meet the needs and goals of people in a specific locale. Sort of that rural-urban divide, or north-south, or whatever sort of divide you may necessarily have, much less, you know, you deal like with the United States, you have 50 additional units. And so here's where I think the non-parametric sort of models may continue to be extremely important, in the aspect that the data that you're going to get from one state on changes, say, in policing, which, you know, this isn't necessarily in my area, I barely touch it, but I know some stuff. The information that's available in one, say, my hometown of Chicago, is very different from the information that may necessarily be available, say, in Jackson, Mississippi. Two large urban centers, but whether or not the information is readily available for us to obtain, consistency of data that's offered and made transparent may be very different from one another. And so at that point, that we're dealing with a lot of missiness. We're going to be dealing with a lot of a number of issues that impacts the data structure, that makes maybe things like multi-level modeling and other types of analyses very, very difficult, because we just simply don't have the data type and the data structure necessary to meet the assumptions of those types of models. And so when we're dealing with this sort of disparity in quality of data, we're going to need measurement techniques that are a little bit more forgiving. And this is why Siri and why my data set, the MPI, uses things like Mokken Scale analysis, is that you're going to need a little bit more forgiveness, because you simply can't meet that. You simply won't have the data and the quality of data to sort of meet the assumptions necessary for certain techniques. And once we add in issues such as differences between, you know, county to county and village to village, the data structure is going to be all over the place. So good luck to all the Americanists out there who are trying to do this. I'm like, good for you. So the quality of data is going to be relatively problematic. And again, we're still looking at something that's very much so multidimensional. We're looking at something that is extremely important So people want the answers to this. We're looking at something where politics and economics may impact whether or not that data is available and how it's available in the form of which is available, and impacts what people want to see out of that data. And so the type of techniques, to get back your sort of technical question, the type of techniques that are out there are ones where scholars are going to need to take advantage of the fact that we have just some really amazing packages and new techniques out there that addresses issues of missingness, that addresses inconsistencies across time and space and disparities between locales. And so here's where, I have a friend who does geotagging of policing, police cameras, et cetera. There's a vast amount of disparity between that, whether or not the departments are even required to have cameras. So it makes it really hard to answer that question to a certain extent in terms of like the technical aspects of what are out there. But we've moved past just doing the regular OLS or Logit, Probit, that kind of stuff. There's a large number of methods that are out there that people can use. And here's where scholars can be really adventurous in how they can try and apply these new sort of techniques and statistical tools are out there to not necessarily the best set of data. They should just try it and see, and then that way you'll see what holes you need to fill in, and it gives you new projects. In terms of how to actually have a good measure that captures protest outcomes across time and space at the subnational level, I don't have a good answer for that as of yet, because I think that right now most outcomes are purely political. And there are very few actually incorporate any economic outcomes, which quite often can be a driver of a question such you're asking, which is policing. And so there's going to be economic drivers that impact that question. And it definitely has a societal aspect of which political science is notoriously bad at coding and gathering information on societal outcomes of protests. Sociology does a great job. Even anthropology does a great job. We do not necessarily do a great job. And most of the information is found in qualitative studies, is not found in data sets. And so what's going to be needed, I think, to scoot past your question and fully answer you, what's going to be needed is for scholars to quantify this information, that you have a number of you have a great pool. Like there's a deep and quality level pool of qualitative work and monographs that are out there on all of these protests that emerged since 2010. And right now there's only about 3 data sets that actually capture political outcomes, and they only only capture political outcomes, but they also ignore economic outcomes. They ignore societal outcomes because it takes a while to gather that data. And so it's going to require scholars, especially new scholars, to start going after that information and to use the information, the empirical qualitative and quantitative information we have out there, to start putting it into a data set, populating these data sets, making them available, and people to start doing the analyses. And that hasn't yet become a huge trend yet. It was something that, is still very much so a kind of boutique area where there's a very identifiable set of scholars who address this, but there's not necessarily a large number of data sets, quantitative data sets, that people can easily go to and kind of tap into. And so what's needed is for people to start compiling and analyzing that data so that we're able to answer the kind of questions that you're asking me. And that's my cheat answer.
That's very good. That was very adeptly done. So we're towards the end. So Allison, I'll let you kind of ask the last to take us out.
Well, I just wanted to jump in on the depth of this conversation because I'm a complex systems analyst. And, everything that I heard, I was like, she needs to partner with a sociologist who has mixed methods experience and is a complex systems analyst and can help to build these very uncertain counterfactuals that then you can do things like MCMC with and begin to actually sort of try to get better model fits, even knowing that you're never going to get to perfect model fit because below chaos. That like, these are the, this data set and the work that you're doing is like what people like me live for. Like we love that messiness. We love that complexity. We love the like crazy time horizons, the multiple impacts, the sub geography, like that's catnip for a lot of people. Like me. And that, if you haven't hooked up with the Santa Fe Institute or some of the other sort of complexity science, MIT has a great one, centers, you may well be able to find someone that has that sort of great complement to the to what you're doing. And I could just see an incredible partnership emerging.
Nice.
For what it's worth.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Allison. That's excellent. And that is a lovely way to conclude this hour that we've spent together. Thank you again, Dr. Turner, for joining us to share your work with us. And I'm excited to hear about it in the future because it sounds like it's heading in important and much needed direction. So thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. And thanks to everyone for attending. And I hope everyone has a lovely weekend. At least right now, the sky outside is blue and the sun is shining, which probably means it's below freezing. But we gotta take what we can get when we can get it. So have a great weekend, y'all, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you. Bye-bye.